Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming along. My name is Richard from Genesis Research, a better way to optimize health outcomes research. I'm here to introduce Priti Jhingran from Genesis Research and Tijana Ignjatovic from Market Access Transformation.
All right, so Tijana and I are going to tag team and be here for about 30 minutes and hopefully have a very lively discussion. Really nice to see a lot of people here. I was a bit worried that we won't have a big crowd because it was getting a little bit, so really nice to see everybody here. So what we're going to be focusing on is, by the way, can you guys hear me okay? Perfect. Awesome. So what we're going to be focusing on is pair insights and evidence meeting the challenges of the new evidence paradigm. So before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to talk about why we even chose this topic. What led to us focusing on evidence and insights? So here's the situation. We live in a very, very dynamic healthcare environment where there are multiple trends, multiple paradigm shifts. And in this dynamic healthcare environment, evidence and insights are very critical for life sciences companies. And when you generate insights and evidence with speed and acceleration without compromising the scientific rigor, that's where you're able to essentially bring products of value to the market much quicker, faster. That is why it's so important to embed insights when thinking about your evidence package and evidence generation activities. So what we're going to be focusing on is some of the key trends which are creating this new evidence paradigm. How do insights inform evidence strategy? What is the best approach to do that? And then we'll talk about multiple case studies to illustrate our point. And hopefully we'll have time for questions. So with that, let's talk about some of the key trends creating this new evidence paradigm. First, as we said, there's a new paradigm shift, especially in the evidence space. Look at this conference here. You have so many different data sources, platforms which are available above and beyond the standard data sources which were available to us in the past. So these novel data sources, in addition to the standard data sources which were available to us previously, in addition to that, the data integration methodologies which are now available create a new evidence paradigm. And you now have a lot of innovative, rigorous data sources which are available to answer your research questions. And the key point is, and by the way, you can see a lot of the data sources on the screen here, and this is not even a comprehensive list. There are many other platforms and data sources which are available globally as well as locally to answer these research questions. Now, when you have these data sources where you're able to integrate multiple disparate data sources, you're able to answer the questions with much more precision and granularity, because you have instances where you can augment or supplement your clinical trial program using medical records data or claims data or genomics data, diagnostic data, lab data, and data from registries and patient-centric outcomes data. So now going forward in the future, you'll see all kinds of permutations and combinations in terms of blending data from multiple different data sources to answer the questions with much more granularity and precision. With this dynamics, what you're seeing is that you're seeing an increased adoption of evidence informed by insights to support decision-making. You've certainly seen an increase in use of real-world evidence in the pre and the post-registration phase. You're also seeing a lot of augmentation of clinical trial data for reimbursement and regulatory submissions. Some of the specific areas where you've seen evidence being used is to inform elements of the randomized controlled trials which support registration. The other example, which is really becoming more common and will continue to become more prevalent in the future, is contextualization and strengthening the regulatory label using synthetic control arms or external control arms. Another example in this phase where you've seen increased adoption is to answer the research questions in areas where there is a very, very high unmet need, where you have underserved or understudied patient populations. And lastly, using evidence informed by insights to really bring operational efficiency when it comes to clinical trials, because that reduces time for products to come in to the market. Now, why do you see an increased adoption? Certainly, you have many more data sources, right? But you also have an environment where your regulators, as well as healthcare decision makers, are taking active steps towards practical use of real world evidence, right? You have guidelines in place, you have guidelines which outline the key considerations in terms of what are the data standards for them to accept and adopt real world evidence. That applies to the FDA and that applies to the EMA as well. And there are also organizations like Darwin EU, which will be implemented in the future, which will provide that methodological and operational efficiency or expertise in terms of adoption of real world evidence. Same thing applies to the HTAs. The HTA frameworks really provide and encourage the use of high quality real world evidence to reduce uncertainty in the evidence packages which they're using to essentially go through appraisals and evaluate products for access and reimbursement. Now, all the regulators and the reimbursement agencies, when they're evaluating the evidence package informed by insights, their lens is ultimately to bring products of value to the market. And that is because they want to optimize access. And the three things they focus on when they're evaluating the evidence package is, firstly, what is the population with unmet need? What are the relevant comparators in the populations with unmet need? And are the endpoints which are meaningful to the clinicians and the peers really embedded in the evidence package and the trial design, which is used to evaluate the products, both from a reimbursement and regulatory perspective? Now, when you're trying to evaluate these three key elements in terms of what is the unmet need, what is the relevant comparison, and what are the meaningful endpoints, you want to seek advice. You want to seek advice from your reimbursement agencies. You want to seek advice from your regulatory agencies. To prepare for those sessions, you want to also understand what are the insights and what is that feedback from the payers prior to sitting in front of the regulatory and the reimbursement agencies. So we've always had opportunities in terms of seeking advice with the FDA in terms of various different gate stages as you go through the drug development process, right? But we now, more and more going forward, will have opportunities to seek advice from HTAs in terms of scientific advice. Those scientific advice sessions can happen early in drug development, where you would be focusing more on the trial population, the place in therapy for the product, the comparator of interest, the outcomes of interest, as well as whether the programs really have a patient-centric approach. In the later stages, the focus is more on value for money, which is where the cost effectiveness evaluations come in, where if you were to seek scientific advice, you would be focusing on how best to model that the disease of interest. How do you extrapolate from surrogate markers to markers which are meaningful to clinicians and patients? all of this is very much core to what we do within HEOR and the RWE space. But the point is, in the future, you'll see increased trend of these pair scientific advice as we move forward. You also will see joint scientific advice happening more and more with the regulators as well as the reimbursement agencies in the same room providing input. And again, as I said earlier, to prepare for these sessions, you want to make sure your feedback loop and understanding of what's going to be relevant to the pair is baked into your program to be sure that you're increasing the probability of success for optimal access. So keeping that in mind, when you think about insights and baking that or embedding that in terms of informing your evidence strategy and evidence package, the way I think about it is it's a very integrated approach where insights and evidence, when done well and in an iterative way, facilitate efficiency across the product life cycle. And ultimately, the goal is to bring products of value to the market and increasing the likelihood of getting optimal access. But this is not a one and done activity. This is an activity which needs to start much earlier in phases of development, and you need to essentially repeat and have that feedback loop really intact all the way from early stages of development to late stage development. And that's where MAT RPR or MAT RPR and Genesis research come in. You'll see some case studies in terms of how we've been able to embed insights to inform evidence strategy and evidence packages. But when this iterative process is done well, you see accelerated access, you see optimal access, and that's what we're hoping that it'll come through in the case studies. One last point I want to make before I hand over to Tijana is that when you're thinking about evidence and insights, your problem at hand or the issues which you're dealing with in the development stage versus registration versus post-launch are going to be different. In the early stages, you're focusing more on really making sure that the core elements of your program are solid and really have the pair input and insights baked in. As you're getting closer to launch, you want to make sure your value story and value proposition are tight. And then in post-launch phases, you're making sure that your product is differentiated, especially when you have multiple entrants in the market. So these are just some examples of where evidence and insights, when baked together, really make a difference in multiple stages of development. So again, the point which we wanted to emphasize here is start early to bring in the efficiency and effectiveness, and embed insights and evidence in early stages and pull through all the way up to the drug development process. Now let's take a look at a couple of examples which will illustrate the point we've talked about so far. Thank you.
So thanks, Priti. And in the next section, we look at some of the examples where Genesis research and market access transformation have helped companies meet the challenges of the new evidence paradigm through rapid and iterative insights and evidence generation process. So in this first example, we'll discuss how rapid payer feedback was utilized to generate insights on the evolving use of real-world evidence in oncology assessments and really reassessments and inform the real-world evidence generation strategy planning. In this situation, a large biopharma company requested MIT support for gathering payer insights on future use of real-world evidence. And this particular research was more general, above brand, but oncology focused. And the purpose was really dual, both to inform and educate internally, but also to conduct a pulse check on what is a rapidly evolving environment and and really refine the future evidence generation plan and build out internal capabilities to meet those new expectations. So with these objectives in mind, MIT conducted a survey across the 5 listed markets here. And part of the scope was to first assess the current role of real-world evidence, both in initial assessments in oncology, as well as the post-launch reassessments, and then determine what is the actual impact in real life of this evidence from the price and market access outcome perspective, and finally look at some of the future perspectives of where real-world evidence is going and what needs to be in place to really increase the impact. This survey was run on the Market Access Transformations Rapid Payer Response platform, which enabled us to generate insights within 3 weeks from fielding. Now, some of you may have already listened to a related podium presentation this morning, so I won't go into, in the interest of time as well, to lots of the details. It just shows a few highlights of the research. Sorry, this is not moving. Yeah? Oh, okay. So firstly, what we have found that real-world evidence, when we look at initial assessments, tend to have more of a disease information gathering role rather than being project specific. So it tends to define the treatment landscape, to be utilized to define the treatment landscape, as well as the clinical profiles of the relevant comparators. But if you look at the reassessment post-launch, that's where the more product-specific data comes into play. And it's largely used to be confirmatory of the efficacy and safety data of the product, but also to inform the level of utilization in real-life clinical practice. When we looked into the types of studies that payers prefer, that are most impactful, and we looked at a number of different methodological approaches, prospective studies followed by registries really came out on top as the most accepted, most widely accepted methodologies. Prospective studies were favored over the retrospective alternatives, both because of the ability to control the parameters and control for any bias, minimize the risk of bias, whereas the registries were particularly valued if they came from large and independent data sets that were helpful in assessing comparative effectiveness. Electronic medical records were still high up, coming up third in this hierarchy list, and where they were most valuable was for specific data points. They were fairly comprehensive, and if they were robust, they were good at informing situations, for example, treatment sequence. We know that tends to be quite important nowadays in oncology in a number of different indications. Now, we see from, and we've had these discussions today in the conference for the last couple of days, that real-world evidence is gaining prominence. But one of the key questions always is, what impact does it actually make? Does it make any difference? And what the payers have told us is that there is some impact, and Spain is leading in terms of what the payers are reporting in instances where real-world evidence has had an impact from a coverage perspective. Other markets within the scope were more reserved and conservative and generally thought of the real-world evidence as being complementary rather than making a big shift. However, there was more of a trend of seeing an impact at the net price level. In Spain and in France, that tend to be taking form in the adjustment of the financial agreements, whereas in the UK, we've seen that mostly at the exit from the cancer drug funds. The one thing I want to stress here, that in none of these situations, this is going to be a case of real-world evidence being necessarily the one, or certainly not necessarily the driving factor. It is always in conjunction with more mature data, but that's where it's been seen as playing increasingly a role and having an impact. And importantly, thinking about that future aspect. So what does need to change and be in place to see more of an evolving and growing role of real-world evidence, where what the payers are telling us here in this research is aligned with what we've heard in lots of the presentations over the course of the conference so far. Methodological rigor is very important. Data quality, so the data sources quality, the robustness, the comprehensiveness, ideally local data use, that is also key. And also adherence to any guidelines that the HTA payer bodies have already published, seeking advice and really engaging early to understand that the real-world evidence studies that are being put out there are really relevant for addressing the key questions. But what I find particularly interesting is the acknowledgement that there is a need for increased payer acceptance and better perception of this data. And I think that goes hand in hand what we've seen in these 3 points, also credibility, transparency. The more of the really solid real-world evidence studies are coming out there, the more likely the payer is going to move in their comfort zone and actual acceptance of such data. So to close this case study, what I want to highlight is that I think it highlights really 3 points here. Firstly, the rapid payer research was used to inform an understanding of an evolving and increasingly important part of evidence generation. Secondly, the fast nature of this payer research enabled very up-to-date information gathering. And lastly, this information will feed into the future real-world evidence strategy and will end up with future refinement and testing with the payers. In the next example, we'll be looking at how rapid and agile payer research was used to inform registrational trial design and also focus HTA scientific advice discussion ahead of protocol lock. In this instance, a large biopharma company requested MIT support to gather payer insights on the registrational trial design. The asset in question was in phase 2. It was investigated in multiple different oncology indications, and one of the follow-on indications was non-small cell lung cancer. Now, given the increasing complexity of that treatment landscape, the trial design was also rather complex. It had multiple different combinations of therapies, was multiple subgroups, and there was a need for multiple subgroup analyses as well. The client was facing a critical deadline ahead of HTA scientific advice, and they really needed this research within a month. So with these objectives in mind, MIT conducted a survey with payers across the listed 7 markets. And the focus here really was on a very detailed vetting of the clinical trial parameters. We also tested the payer perception of the associated target product profile and explored what price implications in this indication expansion scenario were there. And finally, some of the competitors' products had different, more streamlined trial designs. So we really wanted to understand to what extent that factor may color the view on the proposed registrational trial. This survey was also run on the Rapid Payer Response platform, and an insights report, the findings were produced within 3 weeks of fielding. In terms of what we heard on the feedback of the trial design, payers appreciated the ambitious trial design, the fact that it was trying to answer relevant questions. However, we uncovered multiple access risks, which were really stemming just from the challenges understanding or analyzing and interpreting such complex potential data set, looking at multiple different subgroup analyses, the risk of diluting the treatment effect. And there was also an issue around the trial comparative, which was suboptimal across lots of the markets. And while the ITCs were one of the potential solutions, there were multiple risks, again, because of the trial complexity of delivering that in a sufficiently robust manner. In addition, the fact that the competitors had more straightforward trial design, that also meant that there was a risk of being suboptimally positioned in that competitive landscape. So overall, there were multiple factors that really meant that there was a significant risk of price erosion, and that had substantial implications across the product lifecycle, thinking about this in an indication expansion setting in multiple future indications. Based on this aggregate payer feedback, what MIT proposed to the client to revisit their registrational trial design. And we proposed 3 alternative trial designs, and some of the changes included focusing on only one of the subpopulations in the trial and not going too ambitiously for multiple subpopulations, streamlining the trial arms, and also changing the comparator choice. After the clinical team vetted these alternatives, we went back to the same set of payer respondents within 2 weeks of the first survey, while the topic was still fresh in their mind, and we retested them. So what the follow-up survey found is that which ones were the preferred trial designs from the payer perspective that would minimize access risks. We saw some convergence of opinion, but we also some differences in terms of what the preferred trial design was across markets. By combining those insights, by looking at also the price potential and the access potential across the different countries, MIT was able to select and recommend one trial design to focus on during development, also to focus on during the HTA scientific advice. So to summarize this case study, what it illustrates is how rapid payer and agile payer research was used to test a registrational trial design and really prevent any access risks further down the line. The fast turnaround times allowed the client to pivot and retest their revised strategy still ahead of a time-sensitive milestone. And finally, we know that HTA scientific advice, which is Priti was discussing, is getting more important. Time during those meetings really is precious. So conducting these research ahead allowed more focus and more productive and effective advice meetings. So these couple of studies just illustrate just two situations where conducting payer insights, generating insights in an agile and rapid way can really help meet the new environment and the challenges that Priti has discussed. But I'll pass on the rest of the discussion today to Priti to give us a few more examples.
All right, so I have two more examples, but I think I'm going to just cover one so that we have some time for questions. So let's look at the next one. Oops, sorry. All right, so this was a situation where a clinical stage life sciences company came to Genesis Research, and they wanted support in terms of ensuring that the payer needs were embedded into their trial design and the trial elements. They also wanted support in developing an integrated evidence plan for two of their assets. The first asset was being developed in partnership with another large pharma. And the second asset was one which they were developing as well as commercializing on their own, but they had never brought a product to the market. So it was a little bit daunting for them in terms of ensuring that the payer needs were baked within their evidence package as well as the clinical program. So how did we approach it? We firstly rapidly integrated ourselves into the client's cross-functional team by having these flexible integrated teams, which were multidisciplinary in nature. These teams essentially focused in mobilizing multiple different work streams, which focused on evidence synthesis, developing HTA analogs, as well as strategic insight generation to be sure that we knew and understood that space in terms of the tumor type, as well as some of the historical decisions which had been made from an HTA perspective. Now, when we did all of this, one of the key things we realized is that they needed some help in really honing on the patient population for their trial. They wanted to make sure they were not including patients who would not be responders to their drug. So they essentially wanted to exclude patients who had primary resistance, but the problem was there was no consensus around the definition of patients who had primary resistance. Now, in this case, primary resistance was a marker of progression. So it was really important to exclude them because these patients would have not responded to the drug. So having the data, the empirical evidence, and the HTA analogs to help the clinical development program understand which patients should be excluded from the trial was the major impact we had in providing the strategic input and insight. The one additional impact which we had in working with the client and the cross-functional team within the organization was to really move the PROs higher up in the hierarchy from a statistical analysis perspective. As you all know, in the oncology space, when you have progression-free survival as your primary endpoint, that in itself is not very informative. So when you have PROs, in addition to PFS data, that tells you a bit more in terms of what's the value add and what's the impact of the drug on the patient. So in an effort to really move the PROs, we had to do a lot of behind-the-scenes work And again, taking an analog and an evidence approach to really influence and make a strong case as to why the PROs need to be moved up in the hierarchy was the impact we had for the organization. Now, remember, I talked about two assets. One asset, which was being developed in partnership with another company. Both of the assets needed assistance in developing an integrated evidence plan in early stages of development, which then would be executed as we went along. So where we are right now, if you see the pie charts at the bottom on the left-hand side, we used 2022 to really provide the strategic insights and build the integrated evidence plans. In 2023, we're going to be focusing more on the execution of that plan. We're also planning to build in the MAT RPR insight work to really test the evidence plan, which has been put in place. And we're preparing for an early scientific advice, as well as developing an early model. And the package will then be taken to the HTAs to really get input and feedback. So that's just an example of how Genesis Research, in partnership with MAT RPR, has been able to make a difference in terms of the evidence package, which ultimately, hopefully, will increase the likelihood of success in terms of optimal access. I think we're running a little bit over, so why don't we go to the conclusion and skip one case study and maybe take some questions. So in conclusion, what I want to just highlight is it's really important for life sciences companies to think about evidence and insights in early stages of development and take an iterative approach when it comes to insights and evidence generation. And agile partnerships like the ones Genesis Research and MAT RPR provide can bring in the efficiency and effectiveness to really make a difference and accelerate optimal access.